Okay, so we're talking prolapse today, vaginal prolapse, whether it's anterior wall of the bladder or posterior wall of the rectum, or at the top of the vagina where the cervix, the womb, or the vault would come down. And the vault, as explained in the earlier part of this newsletter, the vault is the top of the vagina that's stitched together after a vaginal hysterectomy or abdominal hysterectomy. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to draw the front view of a bladder, okay? And we're going to use the bladder to show you what we're talking about when we're talking about pelvic floor muscle training and the aims of pelvic floor muscle training in relation to prolapse. So if we have the bladder here, front view, so once again, I'm not an artist, but hopefully you can see that would be the bladder. So you have the fluid level within the bladder, okay, and then you have the bladder neck here, okay, right at this point here. And then this tube here is called the urethra. And that's the tube where the urine passes before you, or as you empty your bladder. Now the pelvic floor muscles sit underneath here. Okay, so if we just draw them like a diagram, okay, so they sit underneath there. The pelvic floor is the base to your core, it's the floor of your core, and it's the main muscular support for your pelvic organs. So your bladder, your womb and your bowel are the pelvic organs. And your pelvic organs do rely heavily on the support of those muscles. But these muscles are under your control. They're not like the muscles of your heart or the muscles of the bladder itself, which are under involuntary control. These muscles here are more like the muscles in your arms or your legs. They are skeletal muscle. And because they are skeletal muscle, you can choose to squeeze them and you can choose to release them, you can train them, you can build them up. And what we can see here is a diagram of maybe a very thin pelvic floor muscle. So the red line is very thin. And with the red line being so thin, then the potential for movement in that bladder, in that pelvic organ, is great. So that arrow is quite big. So if you imagine any sort of pressure coming from above, so whether that's a cough or a sneeze, maybe pressure from the abdomen with effort, so that could be a cough or a sneeze, or it could be lifting, laughing, pushing, pulling. It could also be in relation to impact, so jumping, running, those sorts of movements. If you have a downwards pressure, then to avoid movement of the organ, the bladder is an example here, to avoid movement coming down into the pelvis, what you need is a good force coming in the opposite direction. And if you've got quite a thin, weak muscle, a muscle that's not functioning as well as it should do, then that range of movement, that black arrow there, is going to be greater. So the potential for movement within that bladder, that pelvic organ, is increased. So the aim of pelvic floor muscle training, as with any other muscle training, is to build power, to build bulk, to build flexibility, and overall function of that muscle. And if we focus in on the increase of bulk within that muscle, then over 4 to 6 weeks of starting a pelvic floor training program, which is more than just doing some squeezes, so 4 to 6 weeks, almost like taking your pelvic floor to the personal trainer, as it were, you should start to notice some bulking of the pelvic floor muscle tissue. Okay, so that pelvic floor now has become thicker. And as the pelvic floor becomes thicker or bulkier, it has more muscle fibres included within its structure. And if you've got more muscle fibres, you've got more potential for movement and more potential for power. but also you've got more cushioning. When we're talking about the supportive nature of the pelvic floor, if it's thicker and bulkier, then it's more likely to provide that extra cushioning, that extra support. And if I put in a black arrow now, you can see that because of the bulk in and of itself, that black arrow has been reduced. Now, we're not talking about trying to rigidly hold on to that bladder. We don't want that bladder to be completely rigid. A bladder that is not able to move, it's not got that flexibility, or if it's gripped hold of too tightly, then potentially could become irritated and uncomfortable and potentially have a reduced capacity where the pressure from underneath is too great and it doesn't have any give from the pressure above, and that can cause problems in terms of irritating the bladder and reducing your capacity, increasing frequency and urgency and those sorts of things. So we want a dynamic level of support, and the dynamic part comes from the activity that is available within that muscle. Now, when you've got prolapse symptoms, it's very simple in your mind to think everything feels like it's falling out. Therefore, what I'm going to do is squeeze it all up and just hold it up there. But that leads to a bit more rigidity than we would want within that pelvic organ. So we want a level of cushion and support from a nice bulky thick muscle that is able to squeeze and protect you against excess pressures like jumping, lifting, pushing, pulling, coughing, sneezing, all of those sorts of things that would reduce the potential of movement within this organ to keep it up in that tampon-friendly zone, but also to provide that level of cushioning on a day-to-day basis when there's not this excess pressure that's coming down into that organ. So the cushioning there, if you imagine sitting on a wooden bench, you're going to feel uncomfortable a lot more quickly than you would on a nice soft cushioned sofa. And if your soft cushioned sofa has got lots of cushions around you, you're going to be able to relax more, you're going to be able to feel comfortable for longer. So over here we're thinking of the wooden bench, and over here we're thinking of a nice soft cushioned sofa. So what we're aiming for with pelvic floor muscle training is to move your pelvic floor structures from thin and weak, possibly gripping, dysfunctional, not able to let go, not very flexible, to a muscle that is thick and bulky, able to provide support on a day-to-day basis, but also have the power there to be able to increase that support as and when it's needed. Okay, so hopefully this video just talks you through a little bit about what pelvic floor muscle training is aiming to do when we're talking about prolapse. And obviously we've just been using the bladder as the example for the pelvic organ here, but it could be the womb, it could be the bowel, it could be all three, combination. Okay, brilliant. So hopefully you found that really useful. If you've got any questions, feel free to let me know. But that is just your little bit of information on what we do with pelvic floor muscle training in relation to prolapse.